back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. If you've been following the news at all, you probably need a vacation. I know I do. One of the places I like to go on vacation is Paris. I love the city of Paris. And my next guest, who's been on this show a number of times talking about labor reporting primarily, has written a new book that I'm loving. I'm not completely through with it yet, entitled Paris is Not Dead, Surviving Gentrification in the City of Light. I'm really enjoying it. I wanted to talk to him about it. So first of all, Cole Stangler is a journalist, and you've seen his work in a number of places, including New York Times, Nation, and elsewhere. And again, the new book, Paris is Not Dead. First of all, Cole, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back on, Richard. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure. What was the what made you think of doing this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think a variety of things. One is the book is set in, much of the reporting takes place in the northeast of Paris, which is a part of the city that I was living in the 18th and the 19th arrondissements in the northeast of Paris, which is, sort of the I would say the last kind of remaining affordable stretch of the city. So I think seeing what was happening around me and looking at the neighborhoods that I was living in, certainly was a source of inspiration. I think on a kind of personal level, but also on a more professional level. As a journalist based in France, writing primarily in English, I was sort of struck by, without wanting to badmouth my journalistic colleagues too much, struck by the gap in sort of the Paris that often gets portrayed in the media, and particularly Anglophone media. This sort of kind of fantasy Disneyland Paris, Emily in Paris, this image of the city that we have. So the gap between that and the actual Paris that I was experiencing, and that I think most ordinary Parisians experience. And so I think this gap, I think was a source of motivation as well. It made me want to sort of portray this other Paris, for lack of a better word, to borrow a phrase from the great writer Lucy Sante, who also has a book called The Other Paris that's more historical. Mine is more contemporary. So I think that was sort of the motivation. And I think the city I'm trying to capture, the city I was living in, and the city that I'm capturing by doing interviews and trying to celebrate in a lot of ways, still exists, and that's a great thing. That you still have these parts of the city where ordinary people can live, where you can have bustling street life, lots of cultural offerings, shops, restaurants, etc. So it still exists, and that's great. But at the same time, and I think these are kind of the two strands or two of the major threads in the book that are interlinked. It still exists, but it's very much on the defensive, with gentrification and changes that we're seeing to the city. It's becoming increasingly unaffordable. The part of the city that has that ordinary people can live in is shrinking. Housing prices have tripled in Paris, going back roughly to the year 2000. There is a decline in the population in Paris because people are literally leaving the city. About 12,000 people are leaving the city every year, many of them settling in the suburbs because they can't afford to live within Paris proper. And so it's a city that exists, but is very much on the defensive. And that's the kind of city that I'm trying to capture in this book.
I mentioned that I love to go to Paris, but wherever I go, or I don't get to travel nearly as much as I like to find the real place, and I like to connect with the real place. And that's one of the things I really liked about your book. I lived for a while in New York City. I, grew up near New York City, so I've known it a long time. It's become kind of a theme park for, and you see it in things like Ramones t-shirts and, CBGB's t-shirts. I mean, I played CBGB's back in its heyday, and it was, to use the slang of the time, a toilet. It was horrible. But, sort of fetishizing, but it was fun too. But this fetishizing of something that no longer exists, it's a weird form of cultural vampirism. It seems to me the Paris that you're talking about that people don't see is a little bit of that, like the world of Shakespeare and Company books, or the artists and ateliers or whatever.
Yeah.
That's gone, and people are sort of, as far as I could see, people are sort of living a museum version of it. Is that fair? First of all.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say the entire city, but I think it's certainly fair to describe much of the city like that. Neighborhood like the Marais in the center of Paris, where you have, I think at a certain point there are more Airbnbs than actual residents, and then of course Airbnb stopped sharing that data. I think was quite embarrassing. There was a Wall Street Journal article to this effect a few years ago. So a place like the Marais certainly, and much of the city is becoming, a sort of Disneyland, to use the phrase I use it in the book, museumified. We often hear that as well. And I think, there's a lot of different kind of themes and, in this book, but I think one of them, just to kind of bounce off what you're saying, I think one of the ironies, kind of, I don't know if it's a twisted irony, but sad in some ways, is this sort of romanticized image we have of Paris, and I mean, it's similar to New York. So Paris as this kind of artistic mecca. It has this great heritage that now has become kind of part of the commodification of the city. It's part of the story that real estate agents are selling to foreign investors who are buying up property and driving up prices. But this period of Paris as an artistic mecca, the sort of golden years, excuse me, which I say, and I think this is subject to debate to some extent, but really the golden age of Paris as this mecca, as a mecca for the avant-garde and art, the visual arts, literature, film, really it starts around World War I and goes until the 50s, New Wave cinema. And this was really when Paris was the kind of beating heart of so many different movements. And there were so many foreign artists as well who went to the city. But what I'm trying to say is that this period in which Paris emerges as this artistic mecca, that image that real estate developers are still using today, that so much of that period was hinged on affordable housing and low rents. It's quite stunning, actually, if you look at the figures, and it's something that I try to articulate in the book, just the positive impact that affordable housing has on the character of a city. And in the case of Paris, it really paved the way for these artistic golden years. So just to give you a few figures here, Paris had, like France, had rent controls that were put into place at the beginning of World War I, and that were, without boring you over the specific mechanics, more or less extended until the end of World War II. And what that meant is that over this stretch, housing was extremely cheap in ways that I think we don't really understand even today. So in 1948, the national minister for reconstruction, looking at the wreckage of France after the Second World War, contemplating how to rebuild the city, rebuild the country, build new housing, said that French people overall, not just Parisians, but Paris certainly mirrors these trends. He said that French people overall were spending 7 times more on tobacco than on rent in 1948, which is really kind of an eye-popping statistic that's kind of hard to think about today. Because what kind of impact does that have on the character of a city? I'll give you another figure. Before the rent controls, around 1914, French people were spending 15% of their income on rent. By 1948, they were spending 3% of their income on rent. So, I mean, what does a city look like where you have such low rents? It paves the way for lots of artists to come. It allows ordinary people to stay. This was a city that was majority overwhelmingly working class at the time. and I don't want to romanticize the actual conditions too much, because of these rent controls, landlords were not terribly interested in doing a lot of upkeep to the apartments. The conditions were quite dingy in a lot of ways. Small apartments with shared bathrooms. Just not great conditions. But if your goal is to come to a place because you want to be around other young, creative-minded professionals, you don't really care the actual conditions that you're living in, then that's great. It's a great place to be. And likewise, this was a city in which ordinary people could afford to live in, and also experience cultural life in ways that simply aren't possible today. That's not what Paris looks like today. It was a city that was majority working class up until really the 1970s, if you go by the French statistical definitions of working class, the ones that are most commonly used. Whereas today, around 25%, only 25% of the city is classified as blue collar workers or service sector workers, compared to more than 50% on the national level. So this other Paris has, or sort of this affordable Paris has largely disappeared. But like I was saying at the beginning, it still exists in a certain swath of the city, really in the Northeast. It's what I'm trying to capture. And there's a lot of different threads in the book, but maybe I'll just leave it at that.
No, I get that, and by the way, you made your neighborhood sound like a place I really wanted to visit. I do want to visit that. The diversity and the halal butcheries and the fish markets and the kebabs and the. You write it beautifully, actually. You say this neighborhood is not built for visits. It is not designed for wistful reflection about former residents. It's made for living today. And then you say a little later, the shops here cater to the population of the neighborhood, much of which has roots in sub-Saharan Africa, from Senegal and Mali to Cameroon and the Congo. Actually, one of the things I found but didn't get to explore on a couple of trips to Africa was a lot of great African music being played. And I love African music. Then you talk about the fish that's for sale, and that the butcheries on the block aren't for the faint of heart. It must have been fun to go shopping there, if nothing else.
Yeah, no, it was fun trying to identify all those different fish for the book. But I think so. You're describing in the first chapter. I'm going to try to just adjust my screen here because the sunlight is quite distracting. But I think that first chapter is taking place in the 18th arrondissement, and there's a second chapter that's taking place in Belleville. And I think just an important point to emphasize as well that you're kind of alluding to is the fact that there's such an overlap between what's left of these the affordable neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are inhabited by immigrants. So
go ahead.
No, so the 18th arrondissement, just the north of Paris, has a very heavily immigrant population, and so does a neighborhood called Belleville, which I spend a lot of time in as well in the second chapter, and it creates a really interesting culture. I think I don't use the term explicitly in the book. Well, I might have once. I don't think I quite credit the theorist behind it, but there's a Caribbean French Francophone poet who taught at LSU in the U.S. for a long time, named Edouard Glissant, who talks about this idea of creolization, which is the mixing of cultures to create hybrids that then create new hybrids that create new hybrids and sort of create something else. And I think this is a really interesting kind of dynamic that you have in these neighborhoods in the north and northeast in the 18th, and certainly in Belleville, where you have immigrants you have a lot of Sephardic Jews and their descendants coming from North Africa who came in the early post-war years. They're still there. You have Muslims or originally Muslim population coming from the Maghreb as well, and particularly the region of Kabylia in Algeria. They're there as well. More recently, you have a big Chinese population. And you had this really odd mix of all these different types of people, that, they're in some ways they're more Parisian than French, and in some ways they're even more Bellevillois than Parisian. And I think this idea of creolization and this sort of, I think really appeals to me. And I think it's the kind of process that you see playing out. I think sometimes especially in the Anglo-American world, when we think about difference, we can often, sometimes assign people categories and talk about communities. That's often a phrase we hear a lot in the Anglo-American world in the U.S. And it'd be weird in Belleville really to talk about the Chinese community, or to talk about the Algerian community or the Sephardic community, because that's not really the way that people conceive of it. They're mixing, and those differences that people have end up creating a hybrid culture that creates something else. And that's really, I think, what's happening. That's the process that's happening in Belleville. And fortunately, it's still alive today. The question is for how much longer. And I think, just to bring in another strand here that's a little bit more political or policy related, there's not really a mystery as to why these people are still living in Belleville. It's quite simple, really. And that's because the housing is cheap, and more particularly because you have a massive amount of social housing. What is social housing? It's state managed or state regulated housing that's rented out at below market rates to low to middle income citizens. You have it everywhere in France. You have quite a bit of it in Paris. It's why much of Paris, these parts that I'm talking about, remain affordable. A place like Belleville has 40% social housing, and that's what allows people to stay there. And I think that's one of the kind of policy tools that I talk about. There's a lot of history in the book as well, but when it comes to this question of how do we preserve, maintain what's left of this sort of Paris where ordinary people can afford to live, that to me is such an essential part of the conversation.
And that makes complete sense to me. I want to explore just a minute more in that context, the whole idea of creolization. First of all, I mean, is there a slang or something that gets developed along with that? Is there an idiom? Are there how does this hybrid culture manifest itself?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you just one example, which I cite in the book. First off, there is all types of French slang that comes from Arabic words. I won't use any of them on the YouTube show in English, but there's all kinds of slang that comes from Arabic and French. But just to give you one example of Belleville, there's a place called Le Zorba, which I report out in the book, and this is a place that during the day in France it's what's known as a PMU, which is a place basically where you go to bet on horse races. So it's older dudes that are hanging out at this cafe, smoking cigarettes, mostly older men speaking Arabic, just kind of hanging out, watching the horse races. Very kind of sleepy place. And that's kind of the general vibe of PMUs in general in France. However, there's kind of this weird pink light that's kind of in the back of the bar, which kind of suggests that maybe there's something else going on here as well. And indeed, at this place, the Zorba also has lots of concerts. They have a little kind of cave area downstairs where they have very experimental music. And so they'll have concerts where you have much younger people that are coming to hang out and not watch horses, but rather to drink and to do God knows what else, and to watch music and to listen to music. And it's a place that also, it's one of the few bars that's still open really early in the morning when a lot of other places close at 2 a.m. And so it attracts kind of the last kind of crowd of people that are partying. And then in the morning, then it's back to 8 in the morning, you have garbage men and construction workers and whatever who are coming to get their coffees in the morning. So to me, it's really, and it's owned by someone whose family emigrated from Kabylia in Algeria. So to me, it really kind of epitomizes this, the northeast of Paris and Belleville in particular, just to give you one example.
And one of the things I was thinking about this creolization too is for a long time, and I imagine still to a certain extent, there was this whole kind of, Académie Française, this whole culture of preserving what it means to be, quote unquote, classically French, right? And it was both in terms of language and resisting the importation of English words, for example, is when I was most familiar with it going on, but foreign words in general. At that point, it was mostly English words. So, not to say computer and so on, not to say cell phone, whatever, but to use French words for French situations to honor French culture, meaning the traditional, European literature and so of France and that kind of thing. So you had that, and of course, the whole idea of secularism and not just as a descendant of, resisting the power of the Catholic Church, but really, in a way, I think it struck me as being used to resist foreign influences in other ways as well. So I'm wondering to what extent that tendency still exists in French politics and French elite culture, and whether they're perturbed by this creolization or other cultural shifts like that.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe give you more background, that term, which I don't really, I talk a little bit about it in the book, but this idea of creolization was then, because there is a political connection, so developed by Edouard Glissant, but then used actually by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the left populist candidate, in the last presidential campaign, really as a direct response to the far-right polemicist Éric Zemmour, who also ran for president, who talks himself about the great replacement, the conspiracy theory, this idea that the foreigners are coming and replacing the white people in France. So Zemmour was getting a lot of media attention. And frankly, this idea of the great replacement is sometimes articulated a little bit differently, but has gained quite a lot of ground in France in recent years in politics and culture. This idea that this is a real phenomenon, and that's quite alarming. Kind of seeping into mainstream discourse. You had the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream right wing candidate allude to it during the presidential campaign as well. So this is kind of an idea that's gaining ground, a conspiracy theory that's gaining ground in France, and creolization was an attempt, I think, by Mélenchon to offer a response to this idea, to really kind of positively talk about the fact that France, acknowledge the fact that France truly is a society made up of creolization, a society made up of people that come from all around the world, for a variety of historical reasons, obviously tied in part to the history of French colonialism.
Right.
So it's an attempt to really recognize French society for what it is. Not this sort of fantasized version of a white France that's under attack, that we see so often, including by very prominent people. If you think about the novels of the novelist Michel Houellebecq,
yeah,
it's this idea that carries a lot of ground. But if you look at France truly as it is today, this is an extremely diverse, multicultural place, even if people don't like using that word. It's a place where 11% of the population is immigrant. And that's not counting the people that are descendants of immigrants who are themselves are not considered, who are not immigrants according to the census. And in particular, to bring it back to Paris and the Parisian region, Paris is a place where 25% of the population is immigrant. It reaches 33% if you go out to the suburbs of Paris. So it's an extremely diverse society. And, I think instead of imagining this sort of fantastical version of white France that only is little small villages and with church bells ringing, that exists too. Certainly it does, but it's not the only France. I think it's outlandish to think that Paris isn't France, or that the Paris region isn't France, or that the city that I live in the south of France, Marseille, isn't France. Of course, this is France too. The problem is that we lack the tools so often, sadly, in France to acknowledge just how diverse of a place this is. I don't think we have the political leaders that people really deserve. Again, Mélenchon had this attempt to sort of respond to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, creolization. I think it's really interesting, but unfortunately, it's still minoritarian today. I think this is going to be a real challenge for the left is to how to positively assert and acknowledge the diverse society that France is today. Yeah.
And you mentioned that, I asked that only because of interest on specifically in that, which I definitely have. I find it fascinating. But also you mentioned, for example, Belleville has 40%, I think you said, public housing, right?
Yeah.
And if you want to preserve that aspect of Paris, or any part of France for that matter, the idea that the government should build or subsidize or maintain or keep housing. There's a global privatization movement. I'm sure a lot of investors would love to get their hands on that housing. Then it seems to me that, but correct me if I'm wrong, that has to be inextricably tied with, well, but do we really want these people around? Am I right about that, or am I jumping to conclusions?
Well, I think maybe to broaden the discussion as well a little bit, and most of the book is focused on Paris. There's 6 chapters, but the last chapter is looking at the giant suburbs of Paris, which also I almost feel silly referring to just this entire space as just one entity, la banlieue, the suburbs, because the suburbs themselves are extremely diverse and made up of different kind of zones as well, but. One of the particularities of Paris, the actual city itself now, just over 2 million people, is much smaller than the actual, in terms of population, than the actual suburban, the entire agglomeration, as we would say in English, which is 11 million people. So 9 million people, over 9 million people living, around 9 million living in this broader suburban zone. And that's really where a lot of the ordinary working class people are fleeing to from Paris. And it's where a lot of people settle when they move to France, or when they move to the Paris area, because this is where they can afford to live. And so certainly, there is a lack of investment, a lack of attention given to much of the suburbs, and particularly the northeastern suburbs of Paris, where, like I was saying, you have a large immigrant population, you have above average levels of poverty, unemployment, and this has been a problem that's been going on for decades. The disinterest. Or the relative lack of interest from the state, lack of investment. And so I think when I in the book, when I talk about kind of, how to, I really am interviewing other people who articulate these points. But, when you talk about how to combat gentrification, how to preserve these cities, how to keep parts of the city affordable, I think a good way, maybe I'll kind of answer this in 2 parts. I'll answer my own question in 2 parts. One is, I think when we're thinking about a response to this, to rising cost of living in cities and gentrification, I think it's helpful to kind of not fall into the trap of saying of simply opposing investment, because I think of course. Cities, when you look at a place like the northeastern suburbs of Paris, the Seine-Saint-Denis, of course you need investment. It's not that you're opposed to investment. The question is, what kind of investment? And the question is, what do people deserve to have when they live in cities? People deserve access to basic public services, transport, healthcare, education. Unfortunately, that's not the case today in much of the suburbs of Paris. They deserve access to culture as well. And again, huge gap between the cultural offerings in Paris, within Paris proper, and the broader suburbs, in particular the Northeast. And they also deserve, I think, without imposing too much of my aesthetic preferences into politics, I think people deserve to have interesting, vibrant, bustling street life. And that often is not the case in the suburbs today. And much, again, not to paint with too broad of a brush, but in much of the suburbs today, where the Northeast is littered with these large housing towers, these large housing blocks. And it's not to criticize, of course, the people living in them, but these urbanistic choices are deprived people of the ability to really participate in city life, the kind of city life that exists in Belleville. And so I think that really thinking in terms of rights, I think, is a helpful way of kind of combating this problem. Not to mention of course, the famous the rallying cry of Henri Lefebvre talking about the rights of the city, is something that I talk about as well in the book. So I think reframing things in terms of rights is important. And then, quickly, I mentioned some of those policies, but social housing is so important. In the United States, social housing, rent controls as well. Maybe I'll make just one point on social housing, because I don't want to blabber too much, but it can be somewhat odd for me to look at the state of the housing debate in the United States, where we have this question just about the YIMBYs versus the NIMBYs, the yes in my backyard versus not in my backyard, as if the one variable we have is only supply. The only thing we can do is you increase supply or not. And of course, supply has to be part of the conversation. But coming from a European perspective and a French perspective, it's not just supply, but it's who owns the housing that we're building. How are we regulating it? Who's managing it? Is it the private sector, or is it the state that's accountable to the public? Do we have a public role? So I think that's such an important point that I want to emphasize. It's up to the state and the public to step into the housing market and to regulate it, to address some of these problems.
The YIMBY NIMBY framing to me has always been a neoliberal approach to a social problem. But listen, unfortunately, I wish we had more time to go into it, but I do strongly recommend your book. Again, my guest is Cole Stangler. His new book is Paris is Not Dead, Surviving Gentrification in the City of Light. So, Cole, thanks for writing it, because I'm enjoying it. And thanks once again for coming on the program.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.